Picture a row of white canvas tents standing in the snow, lined up like teeth along the bare ground south of a place called Ludlow, Colorado, in the spring of 1914. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The wind comes down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and pulls at the canvas walls, and inside those walls live more than 1,000 people. Coal miners, their wives, their children, babies still in swaddling. Old grandfathers who walked here from villages in Greece and Italy and Mexico and Wales. The tents are bone white against the brown plains. The plains roll out flat for miles in every direction, broken only by the dark mouths of mine shafts and the iron bones of tipple towers. To the west, the mountains rise blue and sharp like a wall of frozen water. To the east, the prairie runs all the way to Kansas without a tree to slow it down. The sky here is enormous. It swallows everything. If you walked into that tent colony on a cold morning, you would smell wood smoke and boiling coffee and damp wool. You would hear children laughing in a dozen languages. You would see lines of laundry strung between tent poles, frozen stiff like flags. You would see a Greek man in a brown coat walking from tent to tent, checking on families, speaking soft words. His name was Tikas. Remember that name. The story comes back to him. Now picture that same patch of ground one morning later in the spring. The tents are gone. The laundry is gone. The children are gone. What stands there now is black ash and twisted metal and the smell of kerosene soaked into the soil. 2 women and 11 children lie dead in a pit dug beneath one of the burned tents. Tikas lies dead beside the railroad tracks with a broken rifle next to his body. The coal company guards have ridden away. The Colorado National Guard has ridden away. The newspapers in Denver are already starting to print the official version of events. This is the Ludlow Massacre. It happened on April 20, 1914. It was, by the body count alone, one of the worst acts of violence against working people in the history of the United States. More than 24 people died that day and in the 10 days that followed. Federal troops eventually had to ride in from Washington to stop the killing. President Woodrow Wilson himself got involved. The story ran on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. And then, within about 30 years, it was gone. Not gone like a small thing forgotten. Gone like someone took an eraser to a chalkboard. By the 1950s, most American schoolchildren had never heard the word Ludlow. By the 1970s, you could earn a college degree in American history and graduate without anyone mentioning it. The textbooks skipped it. The encyclopedias gave it a single line, if that. The men responsible for it became saints of American business. Their portraits hung in museums. Their names went on universities and concert halls and foundations that gave away money to good causes. How does that happen? How does a story this large, this bloody, this public, vanish from the national memory in less than a single lifetime? That is the mystery we are going to sit with tonight. Not who pulled the trigger, because in some ways we know. Not who gave the order, because in some ways we know that too. The mystery is the disappearing. The mystery is how a country tells itself a story about who it is, and what it has to leave out of that story to make the telling come out clean. The wind still blows across that empty patch of ground south of Trinidad, Colorado. There is a monument there now, a small stone marker with the names of the dead carved into it. Most days, nobody visits. The grass grows up around the base. The mountains still rise blue and sharp to the west. The prairie still runs flat to the east. And if you stand in the right spot and close your eyes, you can almost hear the canvas snapping in the wind, and the children laughing in a dozen languages, and a Greek man in a brown coat walking from tent to tent, checking on his neighbors before the morning the machine guns came. This is the story of the Ludlow Massacre, and the strange American silence that swallowed it whole. Picture southern Colorado in the fall of 1913. The land rolls out like a brown wool blanket, hills and mesas worn smooth by 1,000 winters. The grass has gone the color of old straw. The cottonwoods along the creeks have turned to gold, their leaves shaking loose in the wind that comes down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. To the west, those peaks rise blue and white, already capped with snow by October. To the east, the plains stretch out flat and empty all the way to Kansas. Beneath all of that beauty sits coal, thick black seams of it buried deep in the rock. The land here looks open and wild, but every canyon and every gulch has been claimed. Every hillside has a mine driven into its belly. The earth here is hollow, threaded with tunnels that run for miles in the dark. The towns are not really towns. They are coal camps, built fast and built cheap by the companies that own the mines. You ride out from Trinidad on a wagon road, past sandstone bluffs the color of dried blood, and you come around a bend, and there it is. A cluster of small wooden houses, maybe 40 or 50 of them, painted the same dull green or the same drab grey. A wooden tipple rises over the mine shaft, tall and black as a gallows. Coal smoke drifts low across the rooftops, mixing with the wood smoke from kitchen stoves. The air tastes like iron and ash. The houses sit in straight rows on hard-packed dirt. No grass. No trees, because trees were cleared long ago for mine timbers. A single dusty road runs through the middle, and along that road you find the company store, the company saloon, the company boarding house, and the little schoolhouse where the company hires the teacher. There is a Catholic church on one end and a wooden bathhouse near the mine entrance. That is the whole world. The mines themselves are the largest things in the country. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company runs most of them, and its name is painted in white block letters on water tanks and rail cars and the sides of buildings. The rail spurs come right up to the tipple, and long lines of black hopper cars wait to be filled. At night, the lamps on the tipple burn yellow against the sky, and you can see them from 10 miles off. The men who go down into those mines wear thick canvas pants and flannel shirts and heavy leather boots with steel toes. They tie kerchiefs around their necks to keep the coal dust out. On their heads sit soft cloth caps with a little brass lamp clipped to the front, fueled by carbide and water, hissing a small blue flame. They carry tin dinner pails packed by their wives before sunrise, a pickaxe over one shoulder, a length of fuse coiled in a pocket. They go down in a cage that drops into the dark like a stone falling into a well. Outside, in 1913, the world above ground still runs on horse and wagon. A few new Ford automobiles cough along the wider roads in town, but in the camps you mostly hear hoofbeats and creaking axles. Women hang laundry on rope lines, their long dresses dragging in the dust, their hair pinned up under cotton bonnets. Children run barefoot in summer and wear hand-me-down shoes in winter, the leather soft and split from too many feet. The light at evening is the thing you remember. The Colorado sun goes down behind the mountains and the sky turns the color of a peach skin. The shadows of the mesas stretch long across the prairie. Lanterns flicker on in the kitchen windows. You can smell coal stoves coming alive, and beans cooking, and lamb stew if it is a Greek house, and cabbage if it is a Slav house, and beef and onions if it is an Italian one. Somewhere a fiddle starts up. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere a man coughs the deep, wet cough of a miner who has breathed black dust for 20 years. This is the country where the story happens. A hard country, a cold country in winter, and a furnace in summer, full of immigrants from 20 different lands, all working the same black seams. The wind never stops blowing across these plains. It carries the smell of coal smoke and pine and sagebrush, and at night it pushes against the thin wooden walls of those company houses with a steady low whistle. In a few months, those wooden houses will stand empty. The people inside them will be living in tents on the open prairie, and the wind that whistles tonight will carry something else entirely. Picture a man named Stavros, though everyone in camp just calls him Steve. He came over from a small village in Crete when he was 19, with one suitcase and a paper address folded into his shoe. His hands are wide and dark, stained black along the knuckles from coal dust that no soap can lift. Every morning before sunrise he pulls on the same canvas pants, the same flannel shirt patched at the elbows, and laces up boots that smell like smoke and wet earth. His wife Eleni packs his lunch pail with 2 pieces of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a small tin cup turned upside down to keep the bread dry. There is a Welsh family 2 houses down named Powell. The father, Owen, sings hymns in a language nobody else in camp understands. His voice is low and slow, like wind moving through a long pipe. His son Davy is 10 years old and already carries water for the mules in the tipple yard. Davy has freckles across his nose and one front tooth missing, where a falling chunk of slate caught him last spring. He does not cry about things like that. Nobody in camp does. Crying does not buy bread at the company store. The houses they live in all look the same. They sit in neat rows like teeth, each one painted the same dull red, each one with the same tar paper roof and the same crooked stovepipe leaning sideways in the wind. The walls are thin enough that you can hear a baby crying 3 doors down. The floors are pine planks laid right on the dirt, and in winter the cold rises up through them like a slow breath. The company built these houses. The company owns these houses. The company can take these houses back any day it wants. In the middle of camp sits the company store. It is the biggest building in town, 2 stories tall, with a long porch and a sign painted in gold letters above the door. Inside, the shelves are stacked with flour and beans and bolts of cloth and tin, cans of peaches in heavy syrup. There is a glass case of penny candy by the register where the children press their noses every Saturday. The clerk wears a clean white apron and writes everything down in a thick ledger book bound in green cloth. Here is the trick of the place. The miners do not get paid in American money. They get paid in scrip, little brass and paper tokens stamped with the company name. Those tokens spend only at the company store. The prices at the company store run about 30% higher than the prices in the free town down the road. So a sack of flour that costs $1 in Trinidad costs $1.30 in Ludlow, and you can only pay with money that works in one building on earth. Eleni keeps her household ledger in a small notebook tied with red string. She writes down every nickel of scrip, every loaf, every pound of sugar, every spool of thread. At the end of most months, the numbers do not work. The rent comes out of Steve's pay before he ever sees it. The doctor's fee comes out. The blacksmith's fee for sharpening tools comes out. The fee for the lamp oil he burns underground comes out. What is left buys food, and what does not fit in the budget gets written in the back of the notebook under a column Eleni labels with a single Greek word that means later. The doctor in camp works for the company. The school teacher works for the company. The preacher who comes on Sundays gets his train ticket paid by the company. The sheriff's deputies who ride through on horseback wear 2 badges, one from the county and one pinned to the inside of their coats that says Colorado Fuel and Iron. Even the saloon at the edge of town pays its rent to the same office in Denver. There are Italians here too, and Slovaks, and Mexicans, and black families who came up from the cotton fields of Alabama. 24 languages get spoken in the camps along this stretch of canyon. Children learn to count in 3 tongues before they can read in any of them. At night, the smell of cooking drifts between the houses, garlic and lamb and chili and cabbage, all mixing in the cold mountain air like a single strange perfume. These are the people. Steve and Eleni and Owen and Davy, and 1,000 more whose names did not make it into any book. They wake before the sun. They go down into the dark. They come back up grey with dust, and they hand their tokens across the counter, and they sleep, and they do it again. To understand how a place like Ludlow came to be, you have to follow the money back east, back across the wide prairie, past the slow brown rivers, all the way to a stone building in Lower Manhattan. That is where the deeds were signed. That is where southern Colorado quietly changed hands while the men who lived there were still asleep in their beds. The name on those deeds was Rockefeller. By 1913, John D. Rockefeller had already become the richest man America had ever made. His oil company stretched across every state like a great black web. But oil was only one of his hungers. He wanted coal too, because coal fed the steel mills, and steel fed the railroads, and railroads fed everything else. So his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., sat in a tall office in New York and looked at a map of Colorado, and the family bought a controlling share of a company called Colorado Fuel and Iron. They called it CF and I for short. Most miners just called it the company. With one stroke of a pen, the Rockefellers owned the largest coal operation in the American West. They owned the mines. They owned the mills. They owned the railroad spurs that ran between them. They owned the land above the seams and the dark veins below. The whole southern half of Colorado became their backyard. 40 mines, dozens of towns, thousands of men with picks and lamps and lungs full of dust. From the high mesas around Trinidad to the long, dry valleys near Walsenburg, almost every chimney that smoked in the morning was burning company coal in a company stove, inside a company house, on a company street. Life moved in slow, steady circles. A whistle blew before sunrise, sharp and lonely across the cold air. Men rolled out of iron beds, pulled on canvas trousers stiff with yesterday's grit, and laced up boots that never quite dried out. Wives stirred coffee on cast iron stoves and packed tin pails with bread and bacon and a single boiled egg. Children watched their fathers walk down the dirt road toward the tipple, lunch pails swinging, breath rising in little white clouds. The towns themselves had a strange, planned tidiness to them. Rows of small wooden houses, painted the same dull grey or the same dull green, lined up like teeth along the canyon floor. A schoolhouse here, a church there, a boarding house for the single men with a long porch and a sagging roof. At the center of every camp stood the company store, 2 stories tall, with big windows and a wide front step where the older men sat and whittled in the long summer evenings. Inside that store, the shelves held everything a family might need: flour in paper sacks, sugar in heavy bins, bolts of calico cloth for dresses, cans of peaches stacked in neat pyramids, lamp oil, boots, tobacco in tin pouches. The prices were higher than the prices in Trinidad or Pueblo, but most miners never noticed, because most miners never carried real money. They were paid in scrip. Little brass tokens or thin paper notes stamped with the company's name and good only at the company's counter. So the money never really left. A miner dug coal. The company paid him in scrip. He spent the scrip at the store. The store gave it back to the company. The wheel turned in the same small circle, day after day, week after week, like a millstone grinding flour from grain that never left the mill. And yet, for many families, this was simply how the world worked. Greeks and Italians and Mexicans and Welshmen had come halfway around the planet for this life. In their old countries, there had been hunger, soldiers, taxes, frozen fields. Here at least there was bread and work and a roof and the great clean sky of the American West. On Sunday afternoons, fathers played accordion music on porches. Mothers stretched dough on flour-dusted tables. Children chased each other between the houses, barefoot and laughing, hair full of black coal dust that washed out pink in the tin tub by the stove. The mountains stood quiet in the distance, blue and folded like old velvet curtains. The cottonwoods along the creeks turned gold every October. The first snow came down soft and slow and made the camp look almost holy in the lamplight. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of home, but the man who owned it all had never seen it. John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son in the tall New York office, had never once set foot in southern Colorado. He only knew it as a number on a ledger, a clean column of figures climbing slowly upward year after year. He came off a ship in New York Harbor in 1906. His real name was Ilias Spantidakis. He was 20 years old then, with dark eyes and a quiet way of standing still while other men moved around him. He was born on the island of Crete, in a village where the houses were white and the sea was blue, and the goats walked the hills like they owned them. He left because there was no work, and because his country was small, and because America was a word that meant something then. By the time he reached the coal camps of southern Colorado, he had a new name: Louis Tikas. The clerks at Ellis Island had trimmed it down, and Louis had kept the trimmed version, the way a man keeps a coat that almost fits. He worked first in Denver as a coffeehouse owner, pouring thick black coffee for other Greek men who had come the same long way. He read books in the evening. He learned English from newspapers. He kept his mustache neat and his shoes polished. even when the dust was thick on the streets. Then he went underground. The mines around Ludlow were hungry for men who could swing a pick and breathe coal dust without complaining. Louis took the work. He went down into the dark every morning with a tin lamp on his cap and a tin pail in his hand. He came up at dusk with his face black and his hands cracked. He slept in a company shack with a thin mattress and a stove that ate more coal than it gave back as heat. He sent letters home to Crete written in careful Greek script. He sent some of his pay too, when there was pay left to send. The other miners noticed him because he listened. That was the first thing. He listened to the Italians and the Mexicans and the Slavs and the Welshmen, and he understood that they were all telling the same story in different languages. He started speaking for them when the bosses came around. He spoke calm and slow, and he never raised his voice, and he never lost his temper, and the bosses began to write his name down in their little black books. In the fall of 1913, a stranger walked into the Greek coffee house in Trinidad, where Louis sometimes sat in the evenings. The stranger wore a heavy coat, though the day was warm. He sat across from Louis and ordered coffee, and waited until the cup was set down in front of him. Then he leaned forward and said something the other men at the next table heard, but never quite understood. He said, "They have made a list. Your name is near the top." Louis stirred his coffee. He did not look up. The stranger said, "When the trouble comes, it will come for you first." "You should think about that," Louis asked who had made the list. The stranger smiled a thin smile and said it did not matter who. He said the list existed, and that was enough. Then he finished his coffee and stood up and left some coins on the table and walked out into the dusty street. Nobody at the coffee house saw him again. Nobody knew his name. Some said later he had been a Baldwin Felts man, one of the private detectives the coal company hired. Some said he was just a drifter who had heard a rumor and passed it on for the price of a cup. Some said he had been sent as a warning, and others said he had been sent as a kindness, and nobody could ever say for certain which. What is known is this: Louis Tikas did not run. He did not buy a ticket to Denver or write to his cousins in Utah or pack his small leather suitcase and disappear into the wide country. He stayed. He kept going down into the mines. He kept listening to the men around him. He kept his moustache neat and his shoes polished, and he kept writing letters home to Crete in his careful Greek script. A few weeks after the stranger came and went, Louis was elected to lead the Greek miners of Ludlow in the work that was coming. He stood up at a meeting in a smoky union hall, and the men voted him in by a show of dirty hands. He nodded once and sat down. That was all. Outside, the wind was already starting to turn cold off the Sangre de Cristo mountains. Snow was a few weeks away. The list, if there was a list, was still out there somewhere, folded in a desk drawer, waiting. The morning of September 23rd, 1913, came in cold and grey over southern Colorado. A low fog clung to the canyons like wet cotton. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet sage, and the dirt roads outside the camps were soft with the first autumn rain. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, 10,000 miners had laid down their tools and started walking. Whole families came with them, pushing carts piled high with quilts, kettles, and tin plates. You could have stood on a low hill above Trinidad and watched them come. They moved in long ribbons down from the high camps, from Berwind and Tabasco and Hastings, from Sopris and Segundo and Forbes. Greek men in heavy wool coats, Italian women with shawls pulled tight around babies, Slovak boys carrying bundles bigger than their bodies, Welsh fiddlers with their cases wrapped in oilcloth. The miners walked side by side with people they had barely spoken to a week before, and now they were brothers. Old-timers in Trinidad came out onto the wooden sidewalks to watch. Some shook their heads, some took off their hats. A few wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands and turned away. They had seen this before. They had seen the walkout of 1903. They remembered the strike of 1894. The land down here, they said, had a habit of soaking up trouble the way a sponge soaks up water. In the back of Sam Gattuso's grocery on Commercial Street, the old men gathered around the Cracker Barrel and traded stories in low voices. One said his father had walked out with the Knights of Labor when he was a boy. Another remembered a Greek priest who had blessed striking miners back in the old country before they ever crossed the ocean. A third said his grandfather had told him the canyons held the bones of Spanish soldiers and Ute warriors, and that the ground itself remembered every fight that had ever spilled blood upon it. The Mexican families in the south end of town told a different story. They spoke of La Llorona, the weeping woman who walked the dry creek beds at night and cried for her lost children. Some of the old grandmothers said they had heard her in the weeks before the walkout, weeping louder than they had ever heard her weep. It was a sign, they said. Something was coming. Something the land had not yet decided how to bear. In the Greek coffee houses on Main Street, the men passed small cups of black coffee and talked of Louis Tikas. They spoke his name softly, the way you speak the name of a saint. He was their voice now. He was the one who could stand in front of the bosses without flinching. He had read the books. He knew the English words. He had the dark, steady eyes of a man who could not be bought. At Holy Trinity Church, the priest told his congregation to pray for peace. But after Mass, on the church steps, the women whispered other things. They said the company guards had been buying extra rifles down at the hardware store. They said a long flat car had come through the rail yard in the night, covered in canvas, and nobody knew what was under it. They said the searchlights up at the camp had been tested all week, sweeping the hills like the eyes of some great sleepless beast. Down at the Toltec Hotel bar, a railroad man who had come up from Pueblo told anyone who would listen that he had seen something strange. A whole train car full of men with hard faces and new boots, traveling on tickets paid for by somebody who did not want their names written down. He said they were detectives from back east. He said they had the look of men who had killed before and meant to kill again. The miners themselves walked on. They did not yet know about the train car. They did not yet know about the searchlights or the canvas-covered flatbed or the men with the new boots. They knew only that they had walked away from the camps where their fathers had died of black lung, and their brothers had died in cave-ins, and their sons had grown up never seeing the sun. They walked toward a meadow north of town, a piece of empty land called Ludlow, where the Union had leased ground for them to live. Behind them, the company towns went silent. The breaker boys were gone. The mule drivers were gone. The pumps stopped running, and the deep mines began slowly to fill with water. The land held its breath, and the fog rolled back across the plains. Long before the canvas tents rose on that frozen plain, the wind had been crossing this ground for thousands of years. The land south of Trinidad is a wide, flat shelf of grass and sage, broken by low ridges where the prairie meets the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos, the mountains to the west where snow most of the year. Their name means the blood of Christ, given by Spanish travelers who watched the dying sun stain the peaks red. That red light still falls on the plain at evening, just as it did the night the workers first staked their tents. The Ute people knew this country first. They moved through these valleys with the seasons, following elk down from the high parks in autumn and back up in spring. They camped along the Purgatoire River, which the old Spanish maps called El Rio de las Animas Perdidas en Purgatorio, the river of lost souls in purgatory. The name came from a Spanish expedition that vanished in these canyons in the 1600s, their bones never found, their priests never able to give them last rites. The river kept the name. The river still carries it today. The Jicarilla Apache rode through here too, and the Comanche and the Cheyenne. They knew the seeps where black water bubbled up from the ground. They knew the dark stone that burned if you held a flame to it. To them, the coal was a curiosity, not a treasure. It belonged to the earth, and they let it stay there. The Spanish came next, with their horses and their crosses and their long muskets. They built small missions and ranchos along the rivers. They left place names like Trinidad and Aguila and El Moro, soft Spanish words that still hang on the road signs. Some of the Ludlow strikers in 1913 were the great-grandchildren of those settlers. Their families had farmed these plains for 2 centuries before a Rockefeller ever heard of Colorado. Then came the Anglo-prospectors, drifting down from the gold camps in the 1860s. They found the coal seams running through the ridges like black ribbons in a layer cake. Word spread. The Santa Fe Railroad pushed its iron tracks south to haul the coal east. Small mining camps sprouted where sheep had grazed the year before. By the 1880s, the canyons west of Trinidad were dotted with company towns that would later belong to the Rockefellers. Berwind, Tabasco, Hastings, Sopris, names half forgotten now, swallowed by sagebrush. The land itself remembered older violence too. Just 60 miles east of Ludlow sits the bend in Sand Creek, where in 1864 soldiers rode down a sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho village at dawn and killed nearly 200 people, most of them women and children. Black Kettle had flown an American flag over his lodge. It did not save him. The massacre passed quickly out of the newspapers and into a long, quiet silence. The same prairie wind that crossed Sand Creek crossed Ludlow. The same kind of silence followed. The miners who pitched their tents in September of 1913 did not know all of this history. Many of them spoke little English. They had come from Greece and Italy, from Slovakia and Wales and Mexico, drawn across the ocean by a single word printed in handbills back home: Colorado. They knew the camps they were leaving. They did not know the ground they were standing on, but the ground knew. The ground had held lost Spaniards and slaughtered Cheyenne and prospectors who froze in blizzards and shepherds whose grave no one marked. It had absorbed every kind of human trouble the high plains could produce, and now it received the canvas town the strikers built with their own hands. They laid out streets in straight lines, the way you would lay out a real city. They dug wells. They built a little wooden stage for speeches and dances. They planted American flags at the corners of the largest tents, because most of them were immigrants who had not yet been granted citizenship, and the flag felt like a kind of armor. Children ran between the tent ropes. Women hung wash on lines stretched between the poles. Smoke from cook stoves rose into the cold blue sky above the sangars. From a distance, on a clear October morning, it looked almost like a country fair. White canvas peaks shining under the sun, horses tethered along the edges. The smell of bread and coal smoke and damp wool drifting on the wind. A town built out of hope and rope, and the simple human need for shelter, raised on ground that had been holding secrets for a very long time. The man who came to look into it was named Don MacGregor. He was a reporter for the Denver Express, and by the autumn of 1913, he had grown tired of the official story. The newspapers in Denver kept printing the same lines, almost word for word. The strikers were lawless. The strikers were foreign. The strikers were violent men stirred up by outside agitators. MacGregor had heard those words so many times they had begun to feel less like reporting and more like a song someone wanted everyone to learn by heart. So he packed a small bag and rode south. The train carried him through pale yellow grass and low rolling hills. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose to the west like a long blue wall, their peaks already powdered with early snow. The land flattened as he came near Ludlow, and the wind picked up, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of coal dust and frost. He stepped off the platform into a place that looked, at first, like any other prairie stop. A water tower, a small depot, a few scattered buildings the color of weathered bone. Then he turned his head and saw the tents. They stretched across the open ground like a strange white city. Hundreds of them, lined in neat rows, their canvas walls trembling in the wind. Smoke rose from stovepipes pushed through the roofs. Children ran between the rows, laughing, their breath visible in the cold air. Women hung wash on lines strung between poles. Men stood in small groups, smoking, talking in a dozen languages MacGregor could not name. It looked like a town built by people who had decided the world owed them a town. But MacGregor was a careful man, and he had not come to admire the view. He came to ask questions. He stayed 3 weeks. He slept in a borrowed cot in one of the tents, and he wrote in a small leather notebook by the light of a kerosene lamp. The strikers welcomed him. They fed him bean soup and black bread, and they told him stories that did not appear in any Denver paper. They told him about the Searchlights. On a low ridge above the colony, the coal company had built wooden towers. Tall ones, and mounted on top of those towers were enormous electric searchlights, the kind used on naval ships. Every night, when the sun dropped behind the mountains and the prairie went dark, the lights came on. White beams swept across the tents in slow, steady arcs, back and forth, hour after hour, all night long. The beams cut through canvas walls and lit up the faces of sleeping children. They moved across the laundry lines and the cook fires and the small wooden privies at the edge of camp. They never stopped. MacGregor watched them himself. He stood in the dark and felt the cold beams pass over his coat like a hand brushing his shoulder. The light was so bright you could read a newspaper by it. The light was so bright you could see your own shadow stretched out long against the snow. People in the colony told him they had not slept a full night in months. They told him the lights had stolen something from them that they could not name, a kind of quiet, a kind of privacy. The simple darkness a person needs to feel they are alone with their own thoughts. There was more. MacGregor walked the perimeter of the camp and counted. Armed guards posted at the rail line, men with rifles on horseback patrolling the road to Trinidad. A strange armored car the strikers called the Death Special parked sometimes on a rise where everyone could see it. The mining company had hired a private agency out of West Virginia called Baldwin Felts. Their men wore dark coats and carried Winchester rifles, and they did not smile when MacGregor asked their names. He wrote it all down. He wrote about the cold and the children and the searchlights and the guards. He wrote about a Greek man named Tikas who spoke 5 languages, and walked the camp at night, soothing arguments and checking on the sick. He wrote about a woman from Italy who had buried 2 infants already that winter, and who told him, through a translator, that she did not understand why a country so rich could not let her family sleep in the dark. When MacGregor returned to Denver, he sat down at his desk and tried to write the story. He wrote it 3 times. Each time, something in his chest tightened, and he set the pages aside. He had come looking for answers. He had found instead a question that would not let him go. They called it the Death Special. That was the name the miners gave it, whispered between tents on cold nights, repeated in kitchens and church halls all across the southern Colorado coalfields. It was an armored car, grey as a winter sky, plated with thick steel and mounted with a machine gun on a swivel. The mine guards built it in a railroad shop in Pueblo, and they drove it slow through the tent colonies to remind the workers what waited for them if they kept on striking. A man named Pearl Jolly was there the day the Death Special came through Forbes. He was a miner, a striker, and years later he told the story to anyone who would listen. He said the morning was clear and cold. The sky over the Spanish peaks looked washed and blue, like fresh paint on a barn door. Children were playing in the muddy lanes between the canvas tents. Women were hanging wash on lines strung between poles, and then somebody heard the engine. Pearl said the sound was wrong. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't a wagon. It was a low metal growl, the kind of noise that climbs up your spine before your brain catches up. He looked toward the road and saw it crawling along the rise, slow as a beetle, sun glinting off its plates. He said the gun on top swiveled like the head of a hunting bird. A woman named Mary Petrucci spoke about that same week, though she lived a few miles south. She remembered hearing the rattle of gunfire after dark and not knowing what to do. She said she pulled her 3 small children into a corner of the tent and held them under a heavy quilt. The bullets, she said, made a soft tearing sound when they passed through canvas. Like paper, like somebody ripping pages from a book in another room. A miner named Mike Levoda told a reporter years afterward what it felt like to stand in the open while the Death Special rolled past. He said his hands shook so hard he could not roll a cigarette. He said he watched a bullet kick up dust near the foot of a boy no older than 10, and the boy didn't even run. The boy just stared, the way a deer stares, frozen by the strangeness of the thing. The car came back more than once. It rolled through Forbes, through Sopris, past the edges of Ludlow itself. It fired into tents. It fired into the dark. The guards inside were sometimes drunk, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent as monks. Nobody could say what made them choose a target. A man hanging wash, a dog crossing the road, a lamp burning too bright behind a tent wall. A Greek miner named Vasilios remembered the night the Death Special came past his tent at Forbes. He was praying, he said, when the first shots hit. He spoke broken English, and when he told the story, he kept saying the same phrase over and over. Like rain, he said, like rain on a tin roof. That was what the bullets sounded like, hitting the iron stoves and the cookpots and the chains that held the tents to the ground. His neighbor, a boy of 16 named Frank Snyder, was shot through the head that night. He was sitting on the floor reading a book by lamplight. Vasilios carried the boy's body out in the morning, wrapped in a blanket. He told the Union men that he could not stop shaking for 3 days. He said his hands felt cold even when he held them to the stove. A woman named Margaret Dominisk said the worst part was not the noise. The worst part, she said, was the quiet after. The way the camp held its breath. The way the dogs would not bark. The way the children stopped crying because crying drew attention, and attention drew bullets. She said the silence after the death special passed was the loudest thing she ever heard. These were the witnesses. Plain people, most of them immigrants, most of them barely able to write their own names in English. They told their stories to union organizers, to government investigators, to grandchildren who sat at their knees and listened. And the stories all carried the same strange weight, the same gentle disbelief, as if the people telling them still could not quite accept that such a thing had rolled through their lives. Pearl Jolly said it best, perhaps, when he was an old man. He said you spend your whole life thinking the world has a shape to it, a floor beneath your feet. And then one morning, a grey car comes over a hill, and the floor is gone, and you never get it back. Winter came down on the southern Colorado plains the way it always did, slow at first, then all at once. By December of 1913, the snow had piled against the canvas walls of the Ludlow colony in soft white drifts. The tents sagged under the weight of it. Smoke from 1,000 small stoves rose into a sky the color of old tin. And the wind, that endless prairie wind, slipped through every seam and stitch like a thief looking for something warm. Inside those tents lived more than 1,000 people, miners and their wives, old men with black lungs, babies wrapped in wool blankets, children who had never known a house with wooden walls. They huddled around iron stoves and breathed the steam of boiling beans. They slept 3 and 4 to a cot. They woke with frost on their eyelashes. If you had walked through the colony that winter, you would have heard something strange. 12 languages braided together, Greek prayers murmured in one tent, Italian lullabies from the next, Slovak hymns rising from a third. Welsh and Spanish and Polish and Mexican Spanish, all weaving through the cold air like smoke from different fires. And here is where the pattern starts to show itself. Because every survivor who later told this story, no matter what language they spoke at home, remembered the same small things. The same details keep surfacing in their accounts. Old men in Pueblo and old women in Denver and grandchildren in Trinidad, all telling versions of a tale they could not have rehearsed together. They remembered the digging. Under each tent, the families had scraped out cellars in the hard red earth, pits about 6 feet deep, lined with wooden planks scavenged from broken crates. At first, these holes were just for cold storage. A place to keep potatoes from freezing. A place to hide a jar of homemade wine from the company guards. But by January, the pits had grown larger. The miners dug them deeper. They widened the openings. They built crude ladders down into them. The women lined the walls with quilts, and nobody had to say why. Everybody knew why. The searchlights from the death special swept the camp at night. The gunshots from the bluffs cracked through the dark at random hours. Bullets had already punched through canvas walls. A baby had been wounded back in October. And so the cellars deepened quietly all through that bitter winter. The children of Ludlow grew up fast that year. Little boys learned to spot the silhouette of a militiaman on the ridge before their fathers did. Little girls learned to pour coffee for striking miners who came in from the picket line with ice in their beards. Babies were rocked to sleep beneath canvas that flapped in sub-zero winds, and the same names keep appearing, across decades, across languages, across the testimonies later collected by federal investigators who could barely keep up with the translators. Louis Tikas, the Greek leader, walking the rows of tents at dawn, checking on the sick. He shows up in a Greek family's memory. He shows up in an Italian widow's deposition. He shows up in a Mexican miner's letter home. The same man, doing the same quiet work, remembered identically by people who never spoke to each other. Mother Jones. The old labor organizer, 83 years old, white-haired and fierce as a hawk. She had come down to Trinidad in the fall and tried to march on the state capital. The militia arrested her and held her in a hospital basement for weeks. The miners in Ludlow knew. The story passed tent to tent in 3 languages by sundown. And the dates line up in ways that no folk memory should be able to manage. October 17th, the day little Frank Snyder was shot through the head while playing outside his tent at Forbes. November 8th, the day the militia broke into a tent at Walsenburg looking for hidden rifles and tore a baby's crib apart. January 22nd, the day Mother Jones was finally released and rode back into the coalfields like a ghost returning to her own funeral. The same dates, the same details, recited by people who could not read or write. People who had no diaries, people who carried these numbers in their heads for 50 and 60 years. That is not how rumors work. Rumors drift. Rumors blur. Rumors mutate with every telling. These memories did not drift. They locked into place like stones set in a wall. Something was being preserved. Something was being remembered on purpose. And the winter wind kept carrying it forward, tent to tent, child to child, year after year. The morning of April 20th, 1914, came up clear and cold over the southern Colorado plains. The sky was that pale-washed blue you only see at high altitude in early spring. Frost still clung to the canvas of the tents. Smoke from the breakfast fires curled straight up in the still air. Somewhere a rooster called, and a child laughed, and a kettle hissed on a small iron stove. It was the Monday after Greek Easter. Many of the families in the colony had stayed up late the night before, dancing on the wooden platform the miners had built between the tents. The smell of roasted lamb still hung faintly in the air. Children were sleeping in. Mothers moved quietly between cookpots, letting the little ones rest. Up on the low ridge to the south, the one the locals called Water Tank Hill, 3 men were already in position. They lay flat behind a machine gun mounted on a tripod. The gun was a Colt, belt-fed, capable of firing 400 rounds a minute. Its long black barrel pointed straight down at the white canvas roofs below. A second machine gun sat to the east, near the steel rail line. A third covered the north. The colony at Ludlow lay in a shallow bowl between them, like an egg cupped in 3 hands. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 dynamite bombs went off in quick succession on the ridge. The booms rolled across the prairie and bounced back off the foothills. Nobody on either side ever agreed on who set them off or why. Some said they were a signal. Some said they were a warning. Some said they were simply meant to start the thing that everyone had been waiting weeks to start. Louis Tikas was already awake. He had been awake most of the night, walking the rows of tents, listening, watching the searchlights sweep across the canvas. When the bombs went off, he set down his coffee and walked out into the open ground at the center of the colony. He looked up at Water Tank Hill. He shaded his eyes with one hand. Then the machine guns opened up. The sound was nothing the families had ever heard. It was not like rifle fire. It was a steady mechanical hammering, a heavy stuttering roar that did not stop. Bullets ripped through the canvas walls like paper. They punched through cook stoves. They snapped the wooden poles that held the tents upright. They sent splinters of pine flying in every direction. Mothers grabbed their children and ran. Some ran toward the steel rail line, thinking the embankment might shield them. Some ran toward the deep arroyo behind the colony, a dry creek bed lined with cottonwood and willow. Some ran in circles, not knowing where to go, because the fire was coming from 3 sides at once. The miners who had rifles grabbed them and ran east, away from the tents, into the low brush along the railroad. They wanted to draw the fire away from their families. They lay flat in the grass and fired back at the ridges, knowing their bolt-action rifles were no match for the machine guns. They fired anyway. Louis Tikas ran from tent to tent. He shouted in Greek, in English, in broken Italian. He told the women to leave everything. He told them to take only the children and run for the arroyo or the railroad culvert, or the deep cellar pits dug under some of the larger tents. He carried small children in his arms. He pulled old women by the wrist. He went back into tents that were already shredded to find the people too frightened to move. The machine guns kept firing. They did not pause. They swept slow arcs across the colony, walking their fire from one end to the other and back again. The white canvas turned to ribbons. The wooden platforms turned to kindling. A water barrel split open, and the water ran out and froze in a long, dark stain across the frozen ground. A train came through. The engineer saw what was happening and stopped his locomotive on the tracks between the ridge and the colony, blocking the line of fire from the eastern gun. He held it there as long as he dared. Then someone ordered him to move on, and he moved on, and the fire from the east resumed. By noon, the tents on the south end were beginning to burn. The smoke rose in thin black columns into that clear blue sky. The shooting did not stop. It would not stop for another 12 hours. And down in the cellar pits, under the burning canvas, the women and the children were already hiding. Beneath one of the tents in the colony, a woman named Mary Petrucci had helped her husband dig a pit. It was a simple thing. A hole in the cold red Colorado dirt, about 6 feet wide and maybe 4 feet deep, lined with rough boards. Many of the families had pits like this. They were meant to be small shelters, places to hide the children when the bullets started flying, which by April of 1914 had become a regular kind of weather. You have to picture it. A canvas tent stretched over wooden frames, ropes pulled taut against the spring wind, and underneath, hidden by the floorboards, a small dark room scooped from the earth. It smelled of clay and damp wood and the faint, sweet smell of children. The walls were cool to the touch. Lanterns flickered down there sometimes, casting orange light on small faces. Mothers had been sleeping in those pits with their babies for weeks. When the machine guns opened up that morning, the women grabbed their children and ran for the holes. Mary Petrucci climbed down into hers with 3 of her little ones. Other women followed. By the time the firing was at its worst, 11 children and 2 women had gathered in that single pit beneath tent number 58. They huddled together in the dark. They could hear the rifles cracking above them like dry branches snapping in a great wind. They could feel the ground shake as bullets hit the dirt nearby. And here is where the story turns strange. Mary Petrucci would later swear on her own life and on the lives of the children she lost that the pit went quiet in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The shooting did not stop. The chaos above did not stop. But inside that small dark room, she said, there came a stillness so thick it felt like wool pressed against her ears. The sound of the world outside grew far away, like she was hearing it from the bottom of a deep well. She said the children stopped crying, not all at once, one by one, like little candles being blown out by a soft breath. They curled against each other and against the women, and they slept. In the middle of machine gun fire, they slept. Mary held her smallest child and could not understand why the baby's breathing had gone so slow and even, as if rocked by some hand she could not see. Some of the survivors who later told the tale claimed they heard singing down in the pit. Soft, low, in a language none of them recognized. Not Greek, not Italian, not Slovak or Welsh or English. Just a humming that seemed to come from the dirt walls themselves, as if the earth had decided to comfort the little ones it would soon be asked to keep. Other women in other pits across the colony told similar stories afterward. They spoke of a warmth that came into the cold ground when it had no business being warm. They spoke of a smell like baking bread when there was no bread for miles. They spoke of children who looked up at the wooden ceiling and pointed and smiled at something the mothers could not see. Nobody can explain these things. The official reports do not mention them. The court hearings did not ask about them. The newspapers, when they wrote about the pit beneath Tent 58, wrote only about what was found inside it the next morning. The strange quiet, the humming, the pointing children. These details lived only in the mouths of the women who crawled out alive, and they were old women by the time anyone thought to write their words down. Mary Petrucci lost all 3 of her children in that pit. She survived. She walked away from the ruins of the colony with her mind half gone, people said, and she lived a long, quiet life in a small house in Trinidad, and she rarely spoke of what happened. But when she did speak, late at night, to a friend or a daughter-in-law, she always came back to the same thing. The quiet, the singing, the way the children had smiled before they slept. She said she did not believe in ghosts. She said she did not believe in angels. She said she only believed in what she had heard with her own ears, and what she had heard was that something had been down there with them. Something old. Something that had been listening to the troubles of working people in that red dirt for a very long time. What it was, she never said. She did not know. Nobody knows. The pit is still there, marked now by a small stone. The wind still moves across it. By the time the sun began to sink behind the Spanish peaks, the colony at Ludlow was already burning. The flames moved from tent to tent like something alive, leaping across the ropes, climbing the canvas walls, curling them into black ribbons against the sky. Smoke rose in a single dark column that could be seen for 20 miles. The prairie wind carried the smell of burning wool and kerosene out across the rail tracks. And in the days that followed, the arguments began over what that fire really was. Some people, even at the time, refused to call it a massacre. They called it a battle. They said the miners had rifles too. They said the first shots might have come from the tents, not the ridge. They pointed to the dynamite the strikers kept hidden in the colony, the cases of ammunition stacked under floorboards, the men who had drilled like soldiers in the weeks before. These were not unarmed sheep, the skeptics said. These were men who had chosen to fight, and fighting men sometimes die. There is something to that argument. The miners did have guns. They had bought them with what little money they had, and they had hidden them in the straw mattresses and the flour barrels. Louis Tikas himself had carried a rifle. The strike had been violent for months before that April day. Mine guards had been shot. Trains had been ambushed. Both sides had buried their dead long before Ludlow ever burned. Some historians have argued that the fire itself was an accident, a lantern knocked over in the chaos. A cook stove, abandoned when the families ran. The tents were canvas soaked in oil to keep out the rain, and one spark in dry April grass could turn a colony to ash in an hour. The militia did not need to set the fire, these voices say. The fire was waiting to happen. It had been waiting all winter. There are even those who blamed the strikers themselves. They said the miners burned their own tents to make martyrs. They said the deaths in the cellar pit were a tragedy of panic, not of murder. A mother who hid her children too well. A pit dug too deep. A door pulled shut against the wrong kind of safety. In this telling, no one ordered the killing of women and children. It simply happened the way terrible things sometimes happen, in the smoke and the noise, when no one is thinking clearly. These are not foolish arguments. They were made by serious men, in serious rooms, with serious paper trails. The coal company hired lawyers and writers and investigators who built whole libraries of testimony to support them. Reasonable people read those libraries and walked away convinced. And yet, there is one thing the skeptics have never been able to explain, and it is the thing that makes even the doubters go quiet when you press them. The militia did not leave after the shooting stopped. They did not pull back to tend their wounded or wait for orders. They walked down into the smoking colony with cans of coal oil in their hands. Witnesses on the hillside, neighbors from Trinidad who had come running at the sound of gunfire, all told the same story. The soldiers moved from tent to tent, pouring fuel along the canvas walls, and then they struck their matches one by one. They did this in the long blue hour of dusk, when there was still light enough to see what they were doing. They did this slowly. They did this on purpose. A fire that starts by accident does not march in a straight line down a row of tents. A fire that starts by accident does not skip the supply sheds and burn only the homes. A fire that starts by accident does not leave behind soldiers laughing in the smoke, posing for photographs with their boots on the burned beds. This is the gap in the skeptic's logic. You can argue about who fired first. You can argue about the dynamite and the rifles and the boys who drilled in the field. You can argue about whether the cellar pit was a hiding place or a tomb, but you cannot argue away the coal oil. You cannot argue away the matches. You cannot argue away the men who stood and watched a colony of canvas burn down to its iron stakes and did nothing to stop it. That is where the skeptics fall silent. That is the place the arguments cannot reach. And out on the prairie that night, while the embers cooled and the wind shifted, 2 women and 11 children lay under the floorboards of a burned tent. They would not be found until morning. Of all the people who stood at Ludlow that April day, one name kept coming back: Louis Tikas, a Greek miner with dark eyes and a steady voice. He had come to America from the island of Crete, the way so many had come, with little money and a pocket full of hope. He learned English in coffee shops in Denver. He worked the mines. He read books at night by the light of a kerosene lamp. And by the spring of 1914, he had become something the company never expected. A leader the workers actually trusted. Tikas was tall and lean, with a thick black moustache and a gentle way of speaking. The Greek miners followed him because he listened. The Italian miners followed him because he was fair. The Mexican miners and the Slavs and the Welsh followed him because when he gave his word, the word held. He walked through the tent colony like a man walking through his own living room. He knew which child belonged to which mother. He knew who had a cough and who needed shoes. He carried the colony on his back like a quiet older brother. On the morning the shooting started, Louis Tikas walked out to meet the militia under a white flag. That part everyone agrees on. He went out unarmed. He went out to talk. He believed, somehow, that words could still do what words were meant to do. He believed there were rules even soldiers had to follow. He walked across the dry yellow grass toward the men with the rifles, and he asked them to stop. What happened next has been told 100 different ways, but the believers, the men and women who were there, they tell it the same. They say Louis Tikas was taken alive. They say Lieutenant Karl Linderfelt, the militia commander, met him face to face on the rise above the tents. They say words passed between them that nobody else could hear. And then Linderfelt raised his Springfield rifle and brought the wooden stock down across Louis Tikas' skull. He brought it down so hard the rifle broke. The broken rifle. That is the detail the survivors held onto for the rest of their lives. The sound of wood splintering against bone. Pearl Jolly, the nurse from the colony, told the story until the day she died. Mary Petrucci, who lost 3 children in the Cellar pit, told it too. The Greek miners told it to their sons, and their sons told it to their grandsons, and somewhere in Crete to this day, there are old men who can tell you about the rifle that broke on Louis Tikas' head. After the rifle broke, the witnesses say 3 bullets went into his back. He was 30 years old. He had come halfway around the world to a tent on a windswept plain, and he died there with his face in the dust. The believers were the ones who refused to let the story go quiet. They were widows in black dresses who stood up at hearings in Washington and named names. They were miners who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. They were children, grown now, who remembered being carried in their mother's arms through the smoke. They spoke when speaking cost them their jobs. They spoke when speaking cost them their homes. They spoke when the company sent men to follow them and take notes on what they said. Mother Jones was one of them. 83 years old, white-haired, fierce as a winter wind. She had been jailed by the militia weeks before the massacre. She came out swinging. She traveled the country telling the story to anyone who would listen. She stood in union halls and church basements and on the marble steps of the Capitol itself. She said the name Louis Tikas in rooms where powerful men did not want to hear it. What these believers gained was not justice. Justice never came. Linderfelt was court-martialed and given a light reprimand. He kept his commission. He went on with his life. The Rockefellers kept their mines. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The believers got nothing the world counts as winning. What they gained was the truth itself, the truth that they had told it. The truth that somewhere, in some attic or library or family Bible, the names were written down and the rifle was broken, and a man named Louis Tikas had walked out under a white flag and met what he met. They gained the small hard stone of memory, and they carried it the rest of their days, and they passed it on, which is how, 100 years later, you are hearing his name now. The morning came slow that April day. The sky over Ludlow turned grey, then pale rose, then a thin, watery gold. Smoke still drifted up from the black bones of the tents. The smell of burnt canvas and kerosene hung low across the plain like a curtain that would not lift. Birds did not sing. They had gone somewhere else, and they would stay gone for a long time. A few people walked back to the wreckage. They walked slowly, the way you walk into a church. Boots crunched on frozen mud and broken glass. Tin cups lay melted into strange shapes. A doll with no head sat upright in the ash, its cloth dress somehow untouched. The wind moved across the prairie the way it always had, but it sounded different now. Thinner, hollow, like a sound that had lost its way home. That was when they found the pit. Someone lifted a sheet of scorched iron, and the smell that came up from underneath made the strongest men step back. In the cellar dug beneath one of the tents, 2 women lay together. Around them, curled into them, tucked under their arms and against their chests, were 11 children. The oldest was 11 years old. The youngest was 3 months. They had gone down into the hole to hide from the bullets. They had not come back up. The land remembers things people forget. Walk that ground today and you will see it. The grass grows in strange patches. Some spots stay green when the rest of the prairie goes brown. Other spots stay bare when the rest blooms. Old ranchers in Las Animas County will tell you their cattle drift around a certain stretch of meadow without ever being driven. The cows just know. They circle wide and keep moving. There is a cottonwood tree near the site that grew crooked. It leans west, away from where the colony stood, as if it spent its whole life trying to look somewhere else. Lightning has hit it twice. It still stands. Locals say the bark feels colder than other trees, even in August, even in the white blaze of the Colorado sun. Whether that is true or just a feeling people carry with them when they walk under its branches, no one can say for sure. The little creek that runs nearby changed course twice in the years after. Maps from 1910 show it bending one way. Maps from 1925 show it bending another. Water finds new paths after fires, after floods, after the ground itself shifts from heat. Some say the creek simply moved on its own, the way creeks do. Others say the land was reshaped by what happened on top of it, that the earth pulled itself into a different shape because it could not bear the old one. The wildflowers came back wrong. Old-timers who used to gather Indian paintbrush and prairie smoke said the colors faded in that stretch of ground. The reds went pink. The purples went pale. A botanist passing through in the 1930s wrote in his field notes that the soil chemistry near Ludlow tested strange, full of iron and ash, and something else he could not name. He moved on before he finished his study. His notebook ended up in a drawer in Denver, and nobody read it for 40 years. Coyotes will cross the old colony grounds at night. Dogs will not. Ranchers have noticed this for generations. A hound that will chase a rabbit across barbed wire and through a river will stop at the edge of that field and sit down and whine. Their owners pull them along, embarrassed, mumbling about ticks or snakes. The dogs know something the people have forgotten. The wind itself carries a different sound across that plain. Stand there at dusk, when the sun drops behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the sky turns the color of an old bruise, and you can hear it, a low humming in the grass. The creak of canvas that is not there. The far-off cry of a child that is only the wind moving through a fence wire, only that, only the wind. 2 women, 11 children. Found at dawn, curled together in a hole in the ground, holding each other the way mothers and babies have held each other since the first fire was ever lit. The land remembers them. The grass remembers them. The cottonwood leans away and the creek bends around and the dogs sit down and refuse to cross. Whatever the history books chose to print, whatever the newspapers chose to bury, the ground itself kept the record, and the ground does not lie. Word of what happened at Ludlow spread across the southern Colorado coalfields like fire through dry grass. By that evening, miners in every camp from Trinidad to Walsenburg knew the tents had burned. They knew the women and children had been found in the pit, and something inside them broke loose. What came next has a name, though most history books never speak it. They called it the 10-Day War. For 10 days in April of 1914, the hills and canyons of southern Colorado became a battlefield. Miners armed themselves with whatever rifles they could find. They rode out from their camps in small bands, faces grim, and they began to fight back. They attacked the mine guards. They burned the company buildings. They struck the towns of Aguila, Delagua, Hastings, and Empire, places whose names mean nothing today, but meant everything that week. The strikers held the high ground in the canyons, and the company men held the rail lines, and in between, the gunfire rolled through the foothills like distant thunder. The snow had melted by then. The prairie was turning green. And men were dying in the green grass for reasons that would be forgotten within 50 years. This is the part of the story that gets stranger the longer you look at it. Because here is the pattern that keeps repeating across America, in different decades and different places, under different skies. Working people are pushed past some invisible line. Something terrible happens. And then comes a brief, fierce uprising that the country quietly chooses to forget. Think of the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, just 7 years after Ludlow. 10,000 coal miners marched through the hills with red bandanas tied around their necks. They fought a private army hired by the mine owners. Federal bombers flew overhead and dropped explosives on American citizens in the green Appalachian hollows. 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired in those mountains. And if you ask the average person today who won that battle, or what it was about, or even that it happened at all, they will look at you with empty eyes. Think of the Bisbee deportation in Arizona, 1917. Almost 1,200 striking copper miners loaded onto cattle cars at gunpoint and dumped in the New Mexico desert without food or water. Think of the Matewan Massacre in the West Virginia rail yard, where a sheriff named Sid Hatfield stood up to the coal company and paid for it with his life on the courthouse steps. Think of the Latimer Massacre in Pennsylvania, where deputies shot down 19 unarmed coal miners in a dusty road in 1897. The pattern shows up again and again. Workers in some lonely corner of the country reach a breaking point. Blood is spilled. A brief, raging conflict follows. And then a strange silence settles over the whole thing, like snow falling on a battlefield. Within a generation, nobody talks about it. Within 2 generations, it might as well have never happened. The 10-day war in Colorado fits that pattern almost perfectly. The miners burned the Empire Mine. They torched the McNally and the Forbes camps. They held off the company gunmen in long firefights along the ridges above Walsenburg. The prairie towns lived through 10 days of open warfare on American soil, and the wind carried the smell of burning timber for miles. Ranchers up in the high country said they could see the smoke columns rising from 40 miles off, dark threads against the blue Colorado sky. It only ended when the federal troops arrived. President Wilson sent the United States Army into the coalfields to restore what the newspapers called order. The miners laid down their rifles when the soldiers came because they trusted the federal government in a way they would never again trust the National Guard. The soldiers disarmed both sides. The killing stopped. And then, like all the others, the story began to fade. The reporters went home. The dead were buried. The hills grew quiet again. Within a few years, the canyons looked the way they had always looked, dry grass and pinyon pine and the long shadows of evening. You could ride through Las Animas County today and never know that men once fought a war there. That is the deeper mystery threaded through Ludlow. Not just what happened on that one April morning, but the larger pattern that swallows these stories whole. Something in this country has a long memory for some things and no memory at all for others. The 10-Day War belongs to that second category, the forgotten ledger, the pages torn out clean. The trains came in late April of 1914. Federal trains. Long black engines pulling cattle cars and supply wagons up the canyons toward the coalfields. President Wilson had finally sent the United States Army into southern Colorado, and the soldiers stepped down onto the cinders in clean blue coats, looking around at a country that smelled of burned canvas and gunpowder. What they found would later be carried out in boxes and crates and quiet leather satchels. Artifacts, pieces of the story that nobody could quite throw away. Some of those pieces still exist today, tucked into archive drawers in Denver and Washington, and the strange thing about them is how much they remember. There is a photograph taken about a week after the burning. It shows the colony at Ludlow flattened to the dirt. You can see the iron bed frames standing up like the ribs of dead animals, blackened and bent. A water pump rises out of the ash. A child's metal cup sits on a stone. In the far background, almost out of frame, 3 men stand near a slope holding their hats in their hands. They are not soldiers. They are not reporters. Nobody ever identified them. They appear in no other photograph from that week. They simply stand there, looking down at something the camera cannot see. The soldiers gathered shell casings by the bucket. Brass rifle cartridges, machine gun belts, the heavy stubs of explosive rounds. One officer wrote in his report that the casings ran in a line along the railroad embankment for nearly 400 yards, thick as gravel under his boots. He filled a wooden crate with them and shipped it east to be catalogued. That crate has never been opened in public. The inventory list survives. The contents do not. In a small museum in Trinidad, behind glass yellowed by decades of sunlight, you can still see a few of the objects pulled from the ruins. A pocket watch, the glass cracked, the hands frozen at 9:20. A pair of child's leather shoes, scorched along the soles but otherwise whole, laces still tied in a careful bow. A tin lunch pail with the name Petros scratched into the lid with a nail. A wedding ring, plain and thin, found in the ash near tent number 14. There are letters too, quiet letters that mention the event in passing, the way you might mention a storm that broke a window. A school teacher in Walsenburg wrote her sister in Iowa that she could see the smoke from her classroom window, and that the children went silent for a whole hour without being asked. A railroad clerk in La Junta wrote his brother that the southbound freight had been delayed because the tracks near Ludlow were too hot to walk on. A priest in Pueblo recorded in his daily journal only 6 words for April 20th. Lord, have mercy on the camp. A miner named John Lawson kept a small notebook in his coat pocket through the strike. It survived because his wife sewed it into the lining of her winter dress and carried it out under the eyes of the guards. The pages are soft as cloth now. They list names, tent numbers, the ages of children. Beside one name, Lawson wrote in pencil, "Sings in the evenings, voice like a bell." That child was 4 years old. That child did not survive the morning of the 20th. The federal soldiers gathered other things too. They pulled a Colt machine gun out of a stand of cottonwoods, still warm, still loaded. The tripod sunk 3 inches into the soft ground. They found a length of telephone wire running from the company offices to a hill above the colony, suggesting someone had been calling in coordinates. They found a steel plate riddled with bullet holes that had been propped on the embankment as a shooting blind. None of these objects appeared in the official trial record. None of them were entered as evidence. They simply went into storage and stayed there. The strangest artifact is a photograph taken by an army photographer on the morning of April 29th. It shows a wide view of the colony grounds. In the lower right corner, almost lost in the shadow of a burned tent pole, you can see what looks like a doll. A child's rag doll sitting upright in the dirt, head tilted slightly, one stitched eye looking straight into the camera. Nobody picked it up. Nobody collected it. By the next day, when soldiers returned to that spot, the doll was gone. These are the pieces that survived. You can hold them. You can read them. And still, the story slips through your fingers like ash. The town of Trinidad sat in a wide valley, ringed by the dark shoulders of the Spanish peaks. In late April of 1914, the streets of Trinidad filled with people who walked slowly, all moving in the same direction. They wore black coats and black scarves. The women covered their heads. The men held their hats in their hands. The wind off the prairie was cold for spring, and it pushed dust down Commercial Street like a slow grey river. The coffins came one by one. Some were small, no bigger than a sled. The wooden boxes were plain pine, the kind a carpenter could build in an afternoon. Each one carried a name that the marchers already knew by heart. Mothers walked behind their children. Brothers walked behind their sisters. Men in mining boots, their faces still streaked with the soot of the deep shafts, carried the small ones on their shoulders. The procession stretched for blocks. People said you could hear the slow shuffle of feet long before you saw the front of the line. A brass band played a slow march, the notes drifting up to the second-floor windows where shopkeepers stood with their hats off. Greek priests in long black robes walked with silver crosses. Catholic priests carried prayer books. Orthodox chants and Latin prayers mixed in the air, rising together like two languages of the same grief. Families who came to America for a better life were now burying that life in the red clay of Las Animas County. Italians, Greeks, Mexicans, Slavs, Welsh, Scots. Names that had crossed oceans only to end in a cellar pit on the plains. The grandparents of the children who died that day are gone now. The parents are gone too, but the great-grandchildren remember. They remember because the story passed from one kitchen table to the next, told in whispers over plates of food on holiday afternoons. In Greek homes around Trinidad and Pueblo, and out into the small towns of New Mexico, families still speak the name Louis Tikas. They say it the old way. With the tongue rolling soft on the L, they tell their children that their great-grandfather walked behind his coffin. They tell them that the women wailed in the old way, the keening that comes from somewhere older than any country. The sound, the elders say, traveled up the canyon and did not stop for 3 days. In Italian families, grandmothers held onto small things. A baby's shoe kept in a tin box. A photograph cut from a newspaper, the edges turned brown as tobacco. A rosary that belonged to a mother who died in the pit. These small things passed from hand to hand at funerals and weddings, the way other families passed down silver spoons. The story came with them, told quietly, the way you tell a secret. Some details got polished smooth over the years. Numbers shifted. A child of 4 became a child of 3. A bullet that struck a tent pole became a bullet that struck a Bible. The retelling, like a stone in a river, wore the rough edges down. But the heart of the story never changed. Machine guns on the ridge, tents on fire in the dusk, women and children in a pit beneath the floorboards, a Union man with a broken rifle and 3 bullet wounds in his back. Other details quietly dropped away. The names of the company guards faded. The name of the mine superintendent slipped from the telling. Even the day of the week grew uncertain in some families. What people held onto was not the calendar. What they held onto was the smell of canvas burning and the sound of the band playing through the streets of Trinidad. The funeral procession that April moved past the old courthouse, past the brick fronts of Main Street, past the Toltec Hotel, where reporters watched from the windows. It moved toward the cemetery on the edge of town, where the ground had been opened in long, fresh lines. 21 graves waited that week. The earth was still cool from the winter, the clay heavy on the shovels. A grandmother in Walsenburg once told her grandson that when her own mother spoke of that day, her mother's voice would drop to almost nothing. She would say the names out loud. Then she would say a prayer in Greek that the grandson did not understand. Then she would be quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the prairie wind moving the grass. That is how the story has lived, not in books, not in classrooms, in kitchens, in whispered names, in the slow shuffle of feet down a Trinidad street. In the days after the funerals, the newspapers came alive. Headlines bloomed across the country like wildflowers after a hard rain. Some told the story one way, some told it another, and the gap between those two versions was wide enough to swallow a town whole. The Denver papers ran black banners across their front pages. The Rocky Mountain News called it a massacre. They printed the names of the dead children. They listed the ages beside each name: 2 years old, 4 years old, 8 years old. The ink smudged on the cheap paper, and the columns ran long down the page, like little gravestones set in rows. Eastern papers told it differently. The New York Times wrote about a battle, a fight between strikers and the militia. The word massacre did not appear on the front page. Down in the lower columns, you could find mentions of women and children. But the headline spoke of armed miners and skirmishes. It spoke of guns on both sides. It spoke of a labor war, not a slaughter. Both things could be true. That was the strange part. There had been guns on both sides. There had been a fight. And there had been a pit full of children who never carried any rifle at all. The story you read depended on which paper landed on your porch that morning. Out in Colorado, the wires hummed day and night. Reporters rode the trains into Trinidad and walked through the ash of the colony. They saw the cellar pit. They saw the burned tent posts standing like broken teeth in the dirt. They wrote what they saw. Some of those stories ran. Some of those stories got cut by editors 1,000 miles away. The Pueblo chieftain printed long accounts from miners who survived. The reporters used real names. They quoted Greek and Italian voices in broken English, and they let the words stand without polish. A woman named Pearl jolly described the machine guns. A man named Frank Snyder spoke of his dead son. The pages smelled of fresh ink, and people read them by oil lamp in kitchens all across the southern plains. But other papers told the company's version. The Rockefeller offices in New York sent out long statements. They spoke of agitators. They spoke of foreign troublemakers. They suggested the strikers had burned their own colony. They suggested the children died from an overturned stove, not from smoke and crossfire. Those statements landed on editors' desks, already typed and ready to print. Some papers ran them word for word. You can still find the clippings in old library drawers. Yellow pages, brittle as autumn leaves, kept in folders behind glass. Read them side by side, and you will see two different countries. One country mourned. The other country argued about who started it. Here is what nobody could argue with. 2 women and 11 children were dead in a hole in the ground. A Union leader had been shot in the back of the head. A tent colony was burned to its frame. And down in the canyons, miners were arming themselves with anything they could find. Whatever name you gave it, something had happened, something that mattered. In Trinidad, the locals did not need the newspapers to tell them. They had seen the wagons. They had heard the keening of the mothers in the church basement. They had passed the row of small caskets in the cemetery and read the dates carved into the fresh stone. The story was written into the dirt of their own town. No editor could change it for them. But for the rest of the country, the story arrived through paper and ink. And paper and ink could be shaped. The same event could be a massacre on Monday and a riot on Tuesday and a tragic accident by Friday. By the time the dust settled, most Americans had read 3 or 4 different versions. They picked the one that fit what they already believed. Then they folded the paper and went on with their day. That is how a thing gets buried, even while it sits in plain sight, not by hiding it, by telling it too many ways, by drowning the truth in a flood of opinions until the water runs muddy and nobody can see the bottom. The wind kept moving across the southern Colorado prairie. The burned colony stood empty. And in towns all across America, families sat at kitchen tables and read what the papers told them. Some wept, some argued, some turned the page to the sports section and forgot the names by supper. The first burial of Ludlow had begun, and it was made of newsprint. Stand for a moment on the open ground where Ludlow once stood. The hour is late. The stars above southern Colorado are scattered like grains of salt across black velvet. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains rise to the west, dark blue shapes against a darker sky. The wind moves low across the prairie grass, soft as breath, carrying the smell of sage and cold dust. There is no town here anymore. Only the old foundations, the quiet road, and the small stone marker the Union built when the grief was still fresh. The night air is thin and clean. You can feel the altitude in your chest. Above your head, the Milky Way arches from one horizon to the other, a river of pale light flowing across the sky. A coyote calls somewhere far off, and another answers. Then the silence rolls back in, thick as wool. The mountains hold the dark like a bowl holds water. This is where the story turned, not just here on the ground, but in offices far away, in rooms full of lamps and typewriters and telephones, where men with soft hands shaped what the country would remember. His name was Ivy Lee. He worked out of an office in New York City, more than 2,000 miles from this empty field. He wore tailored suits and small round glasses. He spoke softly, He was, by every account, a polite man, and he is sometimes called the father of modern public relations. The Rockefeller family hired him not long after the smoke cleared. The newspapers were savage. Crowds were gathering outside Rockefeller offices with signs and torches. Ministers gave sermons against the family. Cartoonists drew John D. Rockefeller Jr. with blood on his hands. Something had to be done about the story, because the story was the only thing left to fight over. The dead were already buried in Trinidad. Ivy Lee began writing bulletins. He called them facts concerning the struggle in Colorado for industrial freedom. He sent them out by the thousands, free of charge, to editors and clergymen and college presidents across the country. They looked plain and official. They read like news, but they were not news. They were carefully chosen words wrapped around carefully chosen numbers, and the numbers did not always match what had happened on the ground. Stand here under these stars and try to feel the size of that effort. Picture mailbags leaving New York by the cartload. Picture small-town editors in Iowa and Tennessee opening envelopes and finding tidy little pamphlets that explained, gently and reasonably, that the strikers had been the real aggressors, that the union leaders were foreign agitators, that Louis Tikas had been a dangerous man, that the women and children in the cellar had died by accident, perhaps by their own hand. The wind moves over the foundations. The grass bends and rises. The marker stands silent in the dark. Ivy Lee did not invent the lie. The lie was already moving through the wires the day after the fire, but he gave it polish. He gave it letterhead. He gave it the calm voice of a friendly neighbor explaining a misunderstanding. And because the bulletins arrived for free, and because they were already written, tired editors printed them word for word. The story spread outward from New York like ripples on a pond, smoothing everything as it went. Carl Sandburg, the poet, called him Poison Ivy. The nickname stuck in certain circles, but it never stuck in the schoolbooks. The schoolbooks came later, and by then the bulletins had done their work. The version of Ludlow that traveled the farthest was the version Ivy Lee mailed, not the version the survivors lived. Look up again. The sky here is the same sky those families slept under in their canvas tents. The same stars wheeled above the searchlights and the snow. The Big Dipper hangs in its old place over the northern ridge. Orion has slid down toward the western mountains. The cold settles on your shoulders the way it settled on theirs. There is a kind of peace here now that feels almost unfair. The land does not seem to know what happened. The prairie has folded the tent stakes back into itself. The cellar pit has been filled and marked, but the grass grows over it just the same as everywhere else. The wind does not distinguish between a story that was told and a story that was buried. And yet you can stand here, small under the stars, and feel something the bulletins could not erase. The ground remembers in its own quiet way. It waits, patient as stone for someone to come listen. Washington in the spring of 1914 smelled like cherry blossoms and wet stone. The marble halls of the Capitol felt cool even in the warming light. And into those halls, one by one, came the miners. They wore their Sunday clothes, the only good clothes they owned. Their hands were rough as tree bark, and they held their hats against their chests like men at a graveside. The House Committee on Mines and Mining had called for hearings. Senators and congressmen sat behind long, polished tables, their pens scratching across yellow paper. The miners were asked to speak. They spoke in broken English, in Greek and Italian and Slavic tongues filtered through tired translators. They told what they had seen at Ludlow. They told about the cellar pit, the burning tents, the bodies laid out in the cold morning grass. Mary Petrucci sat in that chamber and tried to describe what it felt like to bury 3 children at once. The room went quiet as snow. Reporters wrote down every word. The story ran in papers from Boston to San Francisco. For a few short weeks, the whole country looked toward southern Colorado and felt something stir in its chest. Then John D. Rockefeller, Jr., took the stand. He wore a gray suit and a calm smile. He answered each question gently, like a man explaining a small misunderstanding to a child. He had never been to Ludlow. He had never met the strikers. He said he believed in the rights of working men, and he believed his managers in Colorado had acted in good faith. The senators nodded. The pens kept scratching. The hearings stretched on for months. Boxes of evidence piled up in storage rooms. Witnesses came and went. And when it was all over, when the last gavel fell and the last witness walked out into the Washington sun, almost nothing happened. No one went to prison. No company official was punished. The Colorado National Guard officers who had given the orders were tried in military court and quietly cleared. The mine guards walked free. A grand jury in Colorado indicted hundreds of strikers for the killings that followed Ludlow. The men in the tents, the men who had buried their own children, became the criminals. Louis Tikas was dead, so he could not be charged. But his friends could be, and they were. Most of those cases dragged on for years before fading into dusty files no one ever read again. Back in the canyons south of Trinidad, the strike ended that December. The union had run out of money. The tents had been burned. The cold had come again, harder this year, and there was nowhere left to go. The miners drifted back to the pits, hats in hand. Some signed loyalty cards. Some moved north to other fields. Some left mining forever and took up farming on thin patches of prairie where nothing wanted to grow. The towns themselves began to change in quiet ways. In Trinidad, the funeral processions became part of the calendar. Every April, a small group would gather at the site where the colony had stood. They would lay flowers on the iron fence. They would read the names of the dead aloud, one by one, into the wind. The children of the miners grew up hearing those names spoken at kitchen tables, the way other families spoke of saints. In Aguilar and Walsenburg, in Hastings and Forbes, the people developed a way of looking at the world that outsiders never quite understood. They did not trust company men. They did not trust easy promises. They held suspicion in their bones like a weather sense. When a stranger came to town in a clean suit, the old miners would watch him from the porch and say nothing at all. The Greek families kept their own remembrance. They lit candles for Louis Tikas on the anniversary of his death. They told their grandchildren about the tall man with the dark moustache who had stood between them and the guns. In the Italian neighborhoods, women kept photographs of the dead children tucked behind kitchen icons, faded faces watching over the cooking pots. A culture grew up around the absence of justice. The hearings had given the people of southern Colorado a strange gift, though it did not feel like one at the time. They had been heard, their words had been written down, and the writing down, even when it changed nothing, was its own small monument. The country, though, moved on. The headlines faded. The boxes went into the archives. The miners went back into the dark. And the question that hung over the canyons, the question of who would answer for Ludlow, drifted up into the thin Colorado sky and stayed there, unanswered, year after year. Drive south from Denver for about 3 hours, and the land opens up into something that feels almost forgotten. The grass goes pale and brittle in the summer wind. The sky stretches so wide it makes you small. You pass Walsenburg and then Aguilar, little towns that once held thousands of miners and now hold quiet streets and shuttered storefronts. Keep going. Watch for a small brown sign on the side of the highway. It points down a thin road that cuts west across the prairie toward the foothills. That road leads to the monument, a granite statue of a miner and his wife and child, standing on a low platform of stone. Their faces are calm. Their clothes are simple. Behind them, the wind moves through dry grass that grows right up to the foundation. There is no visitor center. There is no gift shop. There is no ranger waiting to tell you what happened here. There is only the statue, the wind, and a small iron gate that someone leaves unlocked. Most days, nobody comes. The road sees a few pickup trucks. A coyote sometimes crosses the gravel at dusk. The mountains in the distance hold their snow even into May, and the light off that snow turns the whole valley the color of brushed silver in the late afternoon. If you stand at the monument long enough, you can hear the train whistles from miles away, carried on air so clear it feels like glass. There is a man named Yanni who used to come here every spring. His grandfather had been a Greek miner in these hills. The grandfather worked the seams below the prairie for 3 years before the strike, and he lived in the tents through that long winter of 1913. When the shooting started that April morning, Yanni's grandfather was 19 years old. He survived by running south through the gullies until his lungs burned. He never went back into a mine again. He carried the story with him to Pueblo, then to Omaha, then finally to a small house in a quiet neighborhood in Detroit. He worked the auto plants for 40 years. He raised 3 sons in a city that knew nothing about southern Colorado. But every April, around the anniversary, he would sit at the kitchen table and speak Greek to himself in low tones, and his children learned not to interrupt him. He had a small tin box. Inside the box was a tarnished crucifix, a folded photograph of a man named Louis, and a piece of canvas no bigger than a playing card. The canvas was scorched black on one edge. Yanni's father inherited the box. Yanni inherited it after that. And once a year, Yanni would drive down from Michigan in his old sedan, 1,200 miles each way, just to stand at the monument and place the tin box on the granite for an hour. He told no one in his neighborhood why he took the trip. His co-workers thought he went fishing. This is how the story traveled, not through textbooks, not through museums, through a tin box in a kitchen drawer in Detroit and 1,000 other boxes like it scattered across the country. A descendant in Phoenix who keeps a folded newspaper clipping her great-aunt saved. A retired teacher in Pittsburgh whose grandmother sang a Greek lullaby that mentioned the name Tikas, though the teacher never knew what the name meant. A woman in Sacramento who inherited a small wooden cross from her mother and was told only that it came from a place called Ludlow and that she must never sell it. The story scattered when the camp burned. The Greeks who survived went back to Greece or pushed on to other coalfields in West Virginia and Kentucky, or boarded trains for the steel mills of the Great Lakes. The Italians went to New York and Chicago. The Mexicans drifted south again, or north into the sugar beet fields of Wyoming. They carried what they knew in their pockets and their language and their songs. Their children half remembered. Their grandchildren forgot the names, but kept the feeling, the strange weight that fell over the kitchen every April when the old ones grew quiet. Yanni stopped making the trip a few years ago. His knees would not let him drive that far anymore. He gave the tin box to his nephew with instructions to take it down at least once before he died. The nephew lives in Cleveland. He has not made the drive yet. He keeps the box on a shelf above his desk, and sometimes he opens it and looks at the scorched piece of canvas, and he tries to imagine the size of the fire that left that small black edge. Think about the schoolbook you carried as a child. The one with the blue cover and the soft pages, the one that lived in your desk and smelled faintly of pencil shavings and glue. Picture the chapter on the early 1900s. There were pictures of Model T cars rolling off assembly lines and grainy photographs of the Wright brothers lifting into the wind at Kitty Hawk. There was Teddy Roosevelt with his round glasses and his big moustache. There was the sinking of the Lusitania, drawn in dramatic ink. There was the long road into the First World War, but somewhere between the assembly line and the trenches, a page was missing, not torn out, not crossed through, just never written. That page would have shown a row of canvas tents on a frozen plain in Colorado. It would have shown a young Greek man with kind eyes named Louis Tikas. It would have shown a cellar pit beneath tent number 58 and the small shoes of children who never came out. It would have shown the smoke rising into a cold April sky and the Rockefeller name carved into stone above marble doorways back east. That page is the one your schoolbook skipped, and the strange thing is this: nobody can quite tell you why. There was no law that forbid the telling. There was no order from a king. There was no fire that swallowed all the records at once. The story simply faded, the way a footprint fades from wet sand when the tide comes in slow and patient and sure. Some say it was Ivy Lee and the men who followed him, the polishers of names and the painters of soft pictures. Some say it was the textbook publishers in their tall buildings, men who needed funding from foundations whose money came from coal and oil. Some say it was time itself, the way time always favors the powerful, the way time covers the unmarked grave first. But the truth is harder to hold than any of these answers. The truth is that a whole country forgot something on purpose, and then forgot that it had forgotten. Think on that for a moment. A massacre on American soil. Federal troops sent in by the president himself. Hearings in the United States Congress that filled thousands of pages. Photographs printed in every paper from New York to San Francisco. Funerals that stopped traffic in 3 states. And within 30 years, a child in a classroom could grow up, graduate, marry, raise their own children, and die without ever hearing the word Ludlow spoken once. How does a country do that? How does a memory that large slip through the fingers of a whole people? The grandfathers who saw the smoke told their sons, and the sons told the grandsons in whispers, and somewhere in that telling the volume kept dropping until the words were just breath, and then the breath was gone. There are men and women alive today whose great-grandmothers crawled out of that cellar pit. They carry the story like a stone in their pocket. They know the names. They know which tent stood where. They know what color the dawn was on April 21st, 1914. And yet when they speak the story to a stranger in a coffee shop in Denver or a diner in Pueblo, the stranger blinks. The stranger has never heard of it. The stranger asks if it really happened, or if it is just one of those old tales people tell. That is the open door of this story. That is the question that has no flaw beneath it. How much else is missing? How many other tent cities burned in the night and left no chapter behind? How many Louis Tikases walked out with empty hands and broken rifles and disappeared from the page before the ink was even dry. How many cellar pits sit beneath the prairie grass right now, waiting for someone to remember the way back. You can stand on the ground at Ludlow today. The wind comes down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains the same way it did then, cold and clean and smelling of pine and dust. The monument is small. The grass is short and brown in winter, green and shivering in spring. There is no gift shop. There are no tour buses. There is only the sky, which is enormous, and the silence, which is not silent at all when you listen close. Listen close. The wind is still trying to tell you something. The page is still trying to write itself back into the book. And somewhere out there, in a classroom you will never see, a child is opening a textbook to a chapter that ends too soon. So here we are, you and me, at the end of the long story. The fire has burned low. The coals glow soft and orange under a thin coat of grey ash. The wind outside has settled into a hush, the kind of hush that feels like the world itself is finally lying down to rest. And somewhere out west, on a wide, flat patch of southern Colorado, the prairie keeps its own quiet vigil. If you stood there tonight, you would see a sky full of stars so thick they almost feel like a second blanket. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains hold the western edge of the dark, their peaks dusted with old snow that catches the moonlight like spilled salt. The plains roll out in every other direction, brown and silver and soft, brushed by a wind that smells of cold sage and dry grass. There are no tents now, no searchlights, no machine guns mounted on hills, just the long, slow breathing of the land. The little monument stands where it has always stood, simple and grey, ringed by a low iron fence. The names cut into the stone catch the starlight in shallow grooves. Petra Valdez, Cedelina Costa, Frank Petrucci, Lucy Petrucci, Joe, Frank, the children, the mothers, Louis Tikas with his calm dark eyes and his broken rifle. The wind passes over the letters the way a hand passes over an old photograph, slow, careful, as if it remembers. You can stand by that fence and hear nothing for a long time. Then, just under the silence, you might catch something. The faint clink of a coffee pot, the scrape of a shovel through frozen earth, a woman singing low to a baby in a tongue she carried across an ocean, a boy laughing at a dog. These sounds are not really there. But they are not really gone either. They live in the dirt and the grass and the patient stone, the way smoke lives in the wool of an old coat long after the fire is out. That is how these stories work. They sink into the ground. They wait. They rise up again whenever someone tells them by a low fire on a quiet night. The schoolbooks closed their pages and the newspapers folded away, and the powerful men shook hands and walked off into their long, comfortable years.